Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Tonight, as I promised, we are going to be talking about assessment and writing, and specifically, I'm going to get really focused today on how I use this board behind me to help assess students' writing and keep them involved and engaged in what assessment looks like in my classroom when it comes to writing. So we're going to dig in and really, I'm going to walk you through how I set this up in my classroom and how we use it with my students so that they can become actively engaged in what assessment of their writing looks like. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty, and I am a 4-5 split grade teacher in Ontario, Canada, and I'm also the teacher blogger behind madlylearning.com. And I come live every single Monday night at 9 o'clock talking about all things inquiry and how we can use more of it in our classrooms in a way that keeps our students engaged and makes teaching fun and interesting for ourselves and our students as well. So like I said, we are going to dig in and go very small into how I set up this Bump It Up board and how I use it specifically for writing assessments. Now, a Bump It Up board is not necessarily something new. Maybe it's new to you. It's been around for a while, and sometimes there was a point in time, I know in my career, where we were told to throw those babies up there, and we did, but we weren't really sure exactly what it meant for students. It was really just something we were told to put up and that it would help students. But I know for me, the first time I put up a board in my classroom, it probably wasn't used as effectively as it could have been. So after a few tries and a few trial and errors, and as well as bringing more inquiry into my classroom and kind of flipping how I teach language in my room, this Bump It Up board has become far more valuable to me because now I'm using more student voice and choice in my classroom. So this makes assessment very clear and outlined for my students, especially when I have students that are writing a whole bunch of different stories or reports all at the same time, and it's far less teacher directed with me saying to students, you will now write a story on this. So because I'm very broad in what my students can write and there really is no limitations, I do need some common way to find an assessment focus for students so that they have a good idea of what a good story or a good nonfiction piece of writing looks like. Just a general outline of what makes a good story or what makes a good nonfiction piece. So we build that together using the Bump It Up board. So first thing that you need for a Bump It Up board is simply just board space. And if you don't have board space, you can actually just use a trifold board, which is what this is actually mounted on, is a trifold board that's just been fastened up into my bulletin board here in my office. And I print out the labels for my headers on these colored Astro Bright paper. Now, I like it to be color coded so that each level has its own color, and this is actually also associated with the colors I use in my digital assessment book, where I will associate different levels with that. So I do like to use the colored paper, and I have the template for those headers, which are actually up in my free resource library. So when you sign up for any of my freebies that are on my website, you get a few emails from me, and one of them will give you a link to that resource library and those headers, so you can get the Bump It Up circles that are right there, as well as the headers for the different levels. All of those are in there, and I just simply, there's about 5 pages, and I printed on 5 different colored paper, and I'm ready to go with my headers. Now, you also need student exemplars for a Bump It Up board. The reason we're using Bump It Up boards, and it's a little bit different from rubrics, is as you can see, you've got a visual representation of students moving up the levels. So this isn't just an assessment tool that you are simply marking their work, such as a rubric, using it and giving it to them, and that's more of a assessment of their learning, and students are not really as involved in that. You can co-create rubrics so that they have an idea, of what it is they're being assessed on, but a Bump It Up board specifically is designed to show students, okay, if currently you're at a level 2, what are the things and skills that you need to add to your writing to move it up to the next level? What do you need to do next? And that's where the Bump It Up board comes in handy. Number one, it gives our students an idea of what makes a level 3 or level 4 piece of writing. What are the qualities of that level 4 piece of writing? So you've kind of got your rubric there with your students, but it also lets students in on what they can do to move up to the next level. What can they add? What can they do differently? What can they improve upon their writing? So you've got a lot of feedback there, as well as that assessment tool of a type of rubric that's built in. So you also need a set of success criteria. Now, this is something that I will do very quickly with my students, is develop a set of success criteria. This is what I have typed out. It's based on conversations with my students on here. What my students do is we make this success criteria together and then they use it. So this is definitely, the Bump It Up board is not something I'm doing at the beginning of the unit. I actually just use the success criteria for a few months. The Bump It Up board is just being built in my classroom right now. It's not something that I built in my classroom in October and that's just been sitting up there. I needed my students to have plenty of opportunities to be able to write, because when they're doing the Bump It Up board, I want them to have the experience and the background knowledge that is relevant for them to be able to understand what exactly is being assessed. They've gone through a few cycles of feedback and conferencing with me on their own pieces of writing so that they have heard some of the evaluative language that we're using when we are assessing our writing. We've also evaluated writing and analyzed different stories that we've been reading, whether it's a read aloud or shared reading or through guided reading. They've had a lot of that vocabulary in how we evaluate writing. Once students have a good idea of and good experience of writing, that's the good time to put a Bump It Up board. So this next thing you need is, after you have the success criteria and your students have a little bit of experience writing, you need to have student exemplars. So I have some of exemplars here. Now you can get exemplars from a lot of different places. You can get them from assessments such as the Ontario Writing Assessments or EQAO for that, or other standardized testing that release student samples with their marks moderated so you can see rubrics. There's Ontario writing rubrics, and there's different writing exemplars across different provinces and states for what student writing looks like at your grade level. You can also simply use former students' writing samples that you've already marked, or you can get your own students' writing and come up with hybrid versions of their stories on topics that interest them. What I don't recommend doing is using actual current students' pieces of writing, because it's a lot of risk to put your students' writing up on the board. Now, if they volunteer their work, that's a different story, but you definitely don't want to use your current students' work up there without their permission, or if it's not something that they are okay with using, because you're really going to kind of strip them down and tear them apart and really be really critical of the writing. And that's really difficult, especially for students at a younger age group. It's something you can do with them one-on-one or with a peer group. I wouldn't say doing that whole class. So I simply go through my fiction samples. So I'll take this fiction sample and I will put it up on my document camera or display it for students, whether it's in a PDF, or if I don't have anything to display with students, I would simply just hand the groups of students a version of the text. And I would ask them, is this a good story? What about this makes it a good story? What doesn't make it a good story? And I go over the success criteria and say, okay, we know that stories have characters that talk and think and feel and do things. We know that it has a setting and it's descriptive and it's got a conflict or a problem and events that the characters solve. We'll go through and I'll remind them of that success criteria and then ask them, the sample that they read, did it have evidence of that? Does it have well-developed characters? Do you care about the characters? Have they described the setting? Does it have a beginning, a middle, and an end? Is there a problem? Is there a solution? What are the events that lead from the problem to the solution? I will prompt them through those questions and ask them to evaluate the piece of writing and see whether or not they meet those things. I will also ask them if they say, okay, well, that one doesn't really have a problem. I said, so does it have a poor problem and a solution? Does it have some evidence of problem solution? Maybe it's good evidence of a problem solution, or is it excellent or great? And I'll go through those qualifiers that are associated with the different levels on the Bump It Up board. And then I will simply make a list with my students. So I'll show you one of the lists that we came up with together. So this is a list that I came up with my students. Now, we went through one sample of writing at a time, first with the level 1. I had them read it. They were flabbergasted that anybody would probably hand me that level 1 sample. They were like, this is not a great piece of writing at all. I always find they're far more critical of others than they are of themselves. And they even acknowledged that themselves, that they were pretty ruthless when it came to evaluating the level 1 sample. But we started there because they needed to see a piece of writing that was pretty obviously not going to be meeting the criteria of our success. So we started with the level 1 and they came up with that list. So they have simple characters. It was unclear or a confusing plot. It had many spelling and grammar mistakes, and I leave those in the student samples. I definitely do not edit for spelling and grammar when I'm showing student samples. Even if they're ones that I made myself, I will just put in errors or leave common errors that my students will use to highlight the fact that that is going to be an issue, especially if it interferes with comprehension. And they talked about that there was little description and little dialogue and setting in actions, that there was some problem, but not a great problem. And it didn't really have a lot of details. And again, they were ruthless at going through why this was not great. And then we went to the level 2 and then the level 3. Today, I actually showed them the level 4 and they still were like, no, that's not good enough. It's not perfect. So we had to talk about realistic expectations of what a level 4 is, and that it's a level 4 doesn't mean perfect, and that there's definitely still going to be areas and places that a level 4 student or an A student would have to go to further their writing. They're not done just because they get a level 4. So we went through and made this list, and this list will then become the areas where we've got the arrows up here on the chart. So what I'll end up doing is I will take these samples and I put them right here on the board so that students can then reference those, and we'll build those together. So as we moderate this first sample, then we will build the other samples as they go up, and students have that as a reference. And I will take the things that they put on their chart that I just showed you. I will take those things that they put on that chart and add them, because what I want my students to begin to see is if they submit a level 1 sample writing, that's not the end. There's a place for them to go, and the Bump It Up board is a place that they can reference, that they helped create themselves. They've got experience moderating this with us, and they can go to that Bump It Up board and figure out with that sample and anchor there, they can figure out what they need to do to bump it up to that next level, because they need to constantly be growing as writers and challenging themselves and challenging their thinking. And being able to use that and having these conversations is extremely valuable with your students if you're working at building their skills as writers, because you want them to continually build and move forward and push themselves. And this gives them kind of the roadmap for what it is that you want them to do, which is why I really like it, especially if you're giving your students a lot of freedom and you are using inquiry. So you've got kids going really wide with all of their different topics, but as assessment purposes, you need to have something to commonly assess all of the variety of things they're writing. I find this commonality of the Bump It Up board, what makes a good story, what makes a good report, and then going through and evaluating on those criteria is really valuable. So I'll show you what the Bump It Up board is currently looking like as it's half done in my classroom here. So I have actually combined the fiction and the nonfiction. So you'll see there's a blank space on the other side of those samples because I'm going to be putting fiction and nonfiction. I'm very lucky that I've got a lot of board space for my literacy. So I will have both fiction and nonfiction writing samples up on my board for students to reference, because they're definitely writing a whole host of things. And I also have that success criteria up there that we talked about a lot in last week's session about how we build that success criteria with our students so that they are participating in their assessment. And then I have, these are the templates that you can get as part of my free resource library when you sign up for any one of my freebies on my blog, and I'll send it to you in an email format. And these are the things that you just simply print off on colored paper, cut out and assemble, and it's ready to go. So you have the B, and they're all ready to go so that they're all color coded there for you. So I hope that gave you some ideas of what you could do and how you could use this. A Bump It Up board, like I said, can actually be used for a variety of different subjects. You can use it for reading. You can use it for math. You can use it for science and social studies. I really love it for writing because I've got students that are writing a variety of things. It really helps keep us focused on the assessment criteria that they are following. And I find that extremely helpful. So if you've got any questions with the Bump It Up board, feel free to throw those in the comments and I will be able to answer any of your questions that you have. And I have to say my students are really, really enjoying having this Bump It Up board and having these conversations. And they're really surprised at how critical they actually are about evaluating these pieces of work, and that maybe they're being a little bit hard on that, and that they're already starting to see some connections on things that they can do in order to push their own writing and experience. So that is all I have for you tonight. I am really hoping that this got right into using this. You can also find any of these fiction samples that I have. They are part of my January Ignited Literacy package. They're actually in week 4, which is the current week that we are on, because we have had a lot of writing experience in that program up until this point, and now it's time to build that assessment piece in with the students. So all of the exemplars and the templates and the instructions on how to assemble this board, pretty much exactly as you see here, and the same that's going on in my classroom, is there for you right there in January 4. And you can find that on TPT, or you can look at the big bundle and really go deep into using. With the Bump It Up board, I actually do not focus on the different genres throughout the year because I'm not really focused on units. I'm allowing students to kind of come in and explore different forms of writing as they're exposed to them through what we are reading in class. And we are looking at those forms of writing through mentor text examples. So I do find with some manipulating and poking and prodding that students do actually try out different things. Now, I do have the benefit of having my students for both grade 4 and grade 5. Most of them will stay with me for both of those years. So I do have a bit more time to work with them, but I am not changing up what's on the board. I really do stick to a very general fiction and nonfiction. And then if I have something specific where we're talking about what makes a good adventure story or what makes a good newspaper report, I do have my writing wheel that I will put up as we are exploring those, and I'll put that on a different board so that they can kind of add those specific details about those genres as they are exploring them. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you again for joining me, and stay tuned for next week, where we are going to be talking about more inquiry-based learning in all of the areas of your classroom, and I hope that you will join me again. So thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.